These are the fat, well-fed men who claim to lead a people and a resistance movement. This is the population they claim to defend. They are far away from the chaos where their people live. There, in Gaza, their representatives are the soldiers who should protect the people, but they dress in humanitarian aid outfits or walk among civilians to disguise themselves among those who wander, suffering and moving from one war zone to another. This is a story of suffering, where a state hunts down the leaders who bring terror to its people, and at the same time commits war crimes during this hunt.
This is the war between the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas.
The terrorist attack on October 7, 2023 opened the gates of hell in the Middle East. What was already a region where war flourished in desert lands turned into fertile ground for battles, joining the list of the bloodiest conflicts of the 21st century. More than 1,000 Israelis died on October 7, including entire families who were killed by surprise, or violently kidnapped and taken to war zones, where they would be tortured and killed. Even babies taken from the bodies of their parents were displayed and taken to that hell. Watching this, obese men surrounded by opulence prayed together in gratitude for that day. These same men moved millions of dollars, prepared tunnels for themselves. Meanwhile, they would see their fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters being censored, shredded by bombings. Houses would be destroyed, thousands would die, while the so-called Hamas soldiers claimed to fight for the dead in a war they knew would happen and knew how it would be. But at what point did they ever use their millions to prepare protection for their people? The attackers were not exempt. Benjamin Netanyahu's government had no clear plans. Hostages died, probably many of them during the Israeli attacks themselves. Some even shot by soldiers after being mistaken for enemies. Children were hit and hunger increased. The fear of bombs became routine, causing damage even after prior warnings. Entire parts of Gaza literally collapsed when the Israelis imploded buildings used by Hamas for combat. The same happened when tunnels built in civilian areas were also destroyed. Obviously, many would say it was a lie, but Hamas's own videos showed their men coming out of tunnels in those areas. Tunnels constructed through extensive work, not just in a day or two. Thus, the war escalated, and the Israelis continued fighting, killing Hamas men, but also letting violent death lay its burning hands on so many innocent people. The actions and war crimes committed by the Israelis were used as propaganda by Hamas's main war spokesperson, Abu Obaida. With his face covered by the traditional red and white Palestinian scarf, he denounced Israel's crimes without ever speaking. Have you ever wondered why so many financial resources were not invested in protecting their own population or in preparing for the war that would come after October 7th? Abu Obaida's first public appearance took place on June 25, 2006, when armed groups, including Hamas, attacked an Israeli military post near the Gaza border. Since then, his figure has become a symbol of the group's military rhetoric. In May 2022, after Israeli statements calling for the assassination of the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, in response to a series of Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians, Obaida stated that if the enemy and its failed leadership targeted Sinwar, there would be a regional earthquake and an unprecedented response. However, When Sinwar was killed in 2024, no earthquake occurred in the Middle East.
In October 2023, in the early stages of the war in Gaza, Abu Obaida declared that Hamas would execute a civilian hostage each time Israel attacked residences in Gaza without prior warning. Despite the successive deaths of several Hamas leaders, Obaida's voice continued to echo throughout the Gaza Strip.
Israel, however, remained determined to hunt him down, just like so many others on its target list.
The Palestinian Islamic Jihad displayed its weapons even before the war when it wanted to demonstrate its power in the fight against Israel. They fired rockets at Israeli territory in 2022 to protest the death of one of their leaders, Khaled Mansour, who was killed by the Israel Defense Forces. The rockets of the Palestinian Jihad flew with low accuracy, scattering in the skies without a clear target in enemy territory. Palestinian Jihad was one of the main Palestinian militant groups, recognized as the second largest armed force in the Gaza Strip, second only to Hamas. The organization was led by Ziad al-Nakalat, whose residence was the subject of speculation, with analysts suggesting it was located in Lebanon or in Damascus, Syria. One of the men responsible for producing weapons for Palestinian Jihad was Muhammad al-Biyok, CE. As a result of his work, weapons were used by the organization's fighters, among the buildings in Gaza to attack Israeli tanks. RPGs were obviously one of the most common weapons, since rockets, although still used, were less useful in the strategies of Hamas and Jihad inside Gaza. Not to mention that these rockets have killed Palestinian civilians several times when they failed. Mortars, launched by masked men dressed in their civilian clothes, also flew against the enemy soldiers, survived during the 3 years of war, until Shin Bet found him hiding in Gaza. He was eliminated around July 2025. That was an exhausting month for the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and especially for Hamas. The Israeli bombers were becoming increasingly active. In June and July of that year, several leaders with regional importance in combat or technical areas of Hamas were hit by Israeli fire.
They fell one after another. Among the dead were Mohammed Abu Awad, responsible for the precision missile project and head of production and technical control for Hamas, and Bilal Abu Tija, a commander involved in weapons manufacturing.
Also a section commander in the armaments area. Commander Salmi, named as one of the main drivers of the group's military development, also lost their life. In Gaza, the offensive also eliminated Bilal Salim and Ahmad Abu Shalama, both heads of military intelligence teams, with the latter also serving as a squad commander. In the same wave of deaths, Mustafa Dabash, deputy head of the weapons production headquarters of Hamas, was killed, as well as Mustafa Rabia Sawil, who was involved in transferring funds for the group's activities. This chain of deaths, concentrated in just a few days, dealt a heavy blow to strategic sectors of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, affecting everything from intelligence to financial logistics and weapons engineering. Of course, Hamas reacted despite its weakened forces after so many Israeli offensives. They still had the active strategy of sneaking through the ruins and to find the Merkava tanks and troop transport vehicles stationed somewhere in Gaza. The triggers of the RPGs were pulled against the stationary armored vehicles, destroying or damaging some of them when their defense systems failed. They had good planning, knowing the Israel Defense Forces' strategy. After finding out where the armored vehicles were parked, they looked for the nearest tunnel exits. From there, with explosives in hand, they waited for the right moment. When no enemy soldier was looking, one of the Hamas fighters stood up and ran to the armored vehicle. He had time to drop the explosive through the open hatch and escape under covering fire. While hearing the muffled detonation inside the tank, at least 3 Israeli soldiers died that day. Idash. The rapid movement of Hamas through the tunnels was hard to detect, even in civilian areas where the Israelis had demolished the buildings. The tunnels were still there, full of passageways where heavy explosives were lifted to be taken to the armored vehicles. The soldiers often didn't even notice this movement. Hamas fighters ran into the tunnels again, under the cover of one of their own firing the rocket-propelled grenade. Sheltered underground, they listened to the explosions. They themselves filmed how they came out from under civilian structures, carrying their RPGs to position themselves among the rubble. From there, they calmly aimed at Israeli equipment before running back underground. Again, the tunnels were an efficient strategy, structures that combined stretched for many kilometers beneath Gaza's sandy terrain. Millions were spent on tunnels winding underground, but these structures would only protect Hamas fighters. Tunnels, by the way, that many knew were being built, both sides, including the United Nations, at the cost of children's lives and labor. Children who saw drugs being handled and trafficked in these closed environments, and who, with their small, calloused hands, put pills in their mouths to endure the work. All of this just so they could only access these tunnels later if they had rifles in their hands. Tunnels that could have been bunkers to protect the population from the war that was coming. But Hamas wasn't as willing to protect as it was to fight. The Israelis responded to this with their own fire. Arafat Diab was among the terrorists who stormed the Nova Festival in Rheims on October 7, 2023. Afterwards, he retreated to Gaza, where he fought in the Sheikh Hediwan Ali battalion. The Israelis made his grave. It was another Hamas casualty in the midst of the fighting, as the Israelis continued to advance inside Gaza. More and more of the strip fell under Israel Defense Forces control, with so many buildings being destroyed, so that Hamas couldn't use them as bases. Despite that justification, it was important to say that it was also a crime to see so many civilian buildings reduced to dust. It was complete destruction, which displaced hundreds of thousands from their homes, leaving them in tents or on the streets. They were exposed to all kinds of danger, including Israeli bombs, which killed many. During this period, Gaza was a densely packed area of dry land where there was little to hide behind and even less to eat. Many were trapped in urban centers, turned into battlefields and squeezed between Hamas and the Israel Defense Forces. And so, they succumbed. Even internally, Netanyahu's government was already facing protests about this. It was to be expected that Hamas, as a terrorist group that had war and death in its founding documents, would not care about its own population. But it was also to be expected that the Israelis, a state whose people suffered in other wars, would maintain moral superiority during this bloody war. That's why voices like Abu Obaida's, the masked spokesperson of Hamas, were raised and ended up telling the truth. Even if he only used it as propaganda and not to fix things. The voice, hidden beneath a scarf, shouted his war propaganda, taking advantage of the deaths of innocents to spread hatred, without offering them protection in his tunnels. Meanwhile, Mehran Mustafa Bajor, the Hamas commander based in Lebanon, led his attacks from the north, launching rockets at Nahariya, Kiryat Muna, and other Israeli cities. Tel Aviv intelligence discovered when he would be moving and targeted his car to be hit by a drone.
An explosion. One less commander.
Salah al-Din Sa'ara, named after one of the great Islamic generals of the Crusades, was the battalion's deputy commander. Was another one visited by Israeli bombs.
The month of August continued with the collapse of Hamas forces. Experienced commanders kept falling. Al-Bakin, who took part in the kidnapping of 3 soldiers on October 7, was in combat when he was hit and killed in Jabalia. He was a commander of one of the special forces companies, Nukiba, being another loss in the chain of command. The head of the Rafah Brigade's control department, who worked in intelligence and surveillance, Nasser Musa, was killed in an airstrike in Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis was a combat center for much of the war, so much so that the Hamas commanders there had been falling one after another over those years. Naif Abu Shamala, another one of the terrorists from October 7th, received Israeli fire as a reward for his actions. There was no chain of command that could withstand so many losses. You can't train a good fighter in a short time in a war like that. Trying to survive, Hamas resorted to more underhanded tactics. The Israelis detected a group of men moving alongside cars marked with the world logo. Central Kitchen, a non-profit, non-governmental organization dedicated to providing meals after disasters or in conflict zones. The Israeli drones observed carefully since months earlier they had made a mistake and, obviously, a war crime, targeting members of the organization, killing 7 humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen who were traveling in 3 non-governmental organization vehicles in the Gaza Strip. But this time, the weapons were clearly seen. Yes, they were armed men wearing vests and using the protection of support groups to move around Gaza and attack Tel Aviv's troops. They gathered together and moved for a while, until they were finally hit and eliminated by an airstrike.
The non-governmental organization itself confirmed and condemned Hamas's actions.
This time, Abu Obaida's voice couldn't echo, claiming it was a lie that Hamas used its people and humanitarian workers as shields. Restless, at some point he let his guard down and the Israelis locked their sights on him. Hamas continued setting traps for the Israeli armored vehicles. They dug deep into the sand of Gaza, in places where enemy tanks passed through. Then they set up their cameras, waiting to witness the destruction of another armored vehicle on the battlefield of Gaza. They weren't always that lucky. When spotted by Israeli drones, it was only a matter of time before an airstrike put an end to their activities. Mortar launches also carried their own risks. Hamas frequently used these projectiles in the Gaza Strip. It was an efficient way to launch explosives after Israeli positions were relayed by the scouts. But the heavier ones were launched from more open areas, making them potential targets for drones. Some of these mortar and rocket launchers were even placed near buildings that were still intact in the urban area, which contributed to the destruction of homes. Throughout this, hunger persisted. Desperate people looted humanitarian aid trucks. At times, Israelis were accused of shooting at Palestinians who were trying to get this food, causing deaths by gunfire or when people were trampled while running in panic. While many lived in amid hunger, others were luckier and ate freely. Hamas was also accused of stealing part of this aid to support its fighters, often punishing with torture the Palestinians who tried to get the food. The discussions about hunger in Gaza became increasingly intense, with accusations from all sides and no definitive solution. Kites with food were dropped from airplanes, always hoping that no one would get hurt when they landed. In the middle of the propaganda war, Abu Obaida was discovered in Gaza City. Many considered Gaza to be something homogeneous, without understanding the organization of the Strip. Gaza City was the most populous city in the Strip until the war caused most of the population to be displaced. The Hamas spokesperson was hiding there, more precisely in the Himmel neighborhood, when Shin Bet obtained information about his whereabouts. Apartment was used as a rhodopological office. Even during 3 years of war and being a wanted target, Abu Obaida chose to keep his family around and take the risk.
The Israelis knew this when they launched the airstrikes against the building he was in. 5 missiles hit the second and third floors of a 6-story residential building. Amid the smoke and rubble, hundreds of thousands of dollars flew through the air, scattering across the streets in chaos. Large amounts were looted before later being recovered by Hamas. At least 11 people died, including Obaida's wife and his children. Another 20 were injured. Injured children, their faces covered in blood, cried in despair, while people ran in all directions, as if the world had come to an end. Obaida's death was an example of the war in Gaza. The choices of leaders claimed innocent lives. Abu Obaida chose to hide in Gaza City, where the Israelis had not yet entered, in a place that was a dental clinic, and still with his family, even though he was one of the main targets of his enemies. He and other Hamas leaders chose not to build bunkers to protect children and women. They preferred tunnels to prepare for war after October 7th. Of course, we also need to consider the blame of the Israelis. The Israelis knew who was with him and repeatedly struck the building anyway. In pursuit of their target, killing children and women, death would continue to roam in Gaza. There were Israeli hostages scattered throughout the Strip. In their path were civilians and ultimately Hamas, hiding behind everything and fighting in the shadows. The war machine under the orders of Benjamin Netanyahu would continue striking until its objectives were achieved. The next steps were precisely entering Gaza City, while also hunting down the Hamas leaders who were living it up in Qatar.